What would you do if you borrowed $50 from your father, flew to Japan alone, walked into a boardroom you had no right to be in, and convinced strangers to trust you with a business you had not yet built? That is how Nike began. Not with a strategy deck, not with venture capital, with a 24-year-old named Phil Knight who had nothing but a crazy idea, a willingness to be embarrassed, and an almost irrational refusal to stop. Shoe Dog is the memoir of how that moment became one of the most valuable companies on earth. Phil Knight is not a traditional business icon. He is not a systems thinker like Bezos or a product visionary like Jobs. He is something rarer and, in many ways, more instructive. He is a man who built an empire through chronic uncertainty, serial near bankruptcy, and relationships so intense they bordered on brotherhood. He spent decades not knowing whether Nike would survive the next quarter. And he kept going. This book is the unfiltered account of what that actually felt like and what it demanded of him at every stage. By the time this breakdown ends, you will understand how Nike was built before anyone knew it would become Nike. Why cash almost killed the company a dozen times before competition ever could. What Phil Knight's leadership style reveals about the kind of people who build world-changing businesses, and why the craziest ideas require the most relentless faith. If any part of you is building something, this book is required reading. Subscribe to The Book Vault right now and hit like, because this channel exists to give you the unfair advantage that comes from learning how the greats actually operated. The crazy idea, we open exactly where Knight opens, with the moment that started everything, what he calls the crazy idea. It is 1962 and a 24-year-old Phil Knight is fresh out of Stanford Business School, carrying a paper he wrote about importing high-quality Japanese running shoes to the American market. Most of his professors thought it was an interesting academic exercise. Knight thought it might be his life, so he did what almost nobody does with a business school theory. He acted on it immediately, before he had funding, before he had a plan, and before anyone told him it was possible. He flew to Japan on a round-the-world trip that his father reluctantly funded, walked into the offices of Onitsuka Tiger, a Japanese athletic shoe manufacturer in Kobe, and told them he represented an American distributor called Blue Ribbon Sports. The company did not exist. He invented the name on the spot, in the meeting, under pressure. He improvised the entire pitch in real time, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, they agreed they would send him sample pairs. He had a deal. He flew home with shoes and a story that was still mostly fiction. The lesson buried inside this origin story is one that most people with business ambitions spend years avoiding. You do not need permission before you begin. You do not need the full plan validated before you take the first step. What Knight understood instinctively and what took him years to articulate is that the act of beginning creates its own credibility. The meeting that sounds impossible before you request it often becomes possible the moment you walk into the room and behave as though you belong there. Confidence is not certainty. It is the decision to move before the certainty arrives. Knight's father was not enthusiastic. His mother was worried. His friends thought the running shoe distribution idea was peculiarly niche and almost certainly unprofitable. And Knight knew all of this. He felt the doubt too, but there was something in him that could not accept a conventional career as the resolution of his life's ambition. He describes this feeling throughout the book with a precision that is almost painful to read. He did not want to play it safe. He wanted to build something that mattered, and that desire, impractical and financially dangerous as it was, became the engine of everything that followed. The birth of Blue Ribbon. The story moves forward into the early years of what would become Nike, and Knight calls this phase the birth of Blue Ribbon Sports. He starts selling Tiger shoes out of the trunk of his car at track meets across the Pacific Northwest. He is not a polished salesman. He is a runner himself, and he talks about shoes the way a runner talks about shoes, which turns out to be far more persuasive than any sales technique. He sells out of his first order in weeks. The response from runners is immediate and intense. People want these shoes. The first person Knight hires is Bill Bowerman, his former track coach at the University of Oregon, and one of the most important figures in the entire Nike story. Bowerman is obsessive about athletic performance and completely indifferent to the commercial aspects of the business. He pulls shoes apart, studies the construction, redesigns the sole geometry, and eventually produces innovations that fundamentally change how running shoes are built. Most famously, he pours rubber into his wife's waffle iron one morning and creates what becomes the Waffle Sole, a product that gives Nike a genuine performance advantage in the market. What is striking about Bowerman is not his inventiveness. It is the quality of the relationship. Knight and Bowerman are not a typical founder and advisor pairing. They share a specific, competitive, emotionally complex dynamic rooted in years of athlete and coach interaction. Bowerman pushes Knight the same way he pushed his runners, relentlessly, sometimes brutally, always in service of a standard that neither of them could fully articulate, but both of them could feel. That dynamic produces tension. It also produces excellence, and it establishes a pattern for how Knight built his inner circle throughout the entire Nike story. The early Blue Ribbon years reveal a financial reality that haunts every subsequent chapter of the book. The company is always undercapitalized. Every time sales grow, the need for inventory grows faster than the cash to pay for it. Knight describes the experience of building a company where success itself creates the crisis. The more shoes he sells, the more shoes he needs to order. The more shoes he orders, the more cash he needs to pay Onitsuka. The gap between revenue and cash flow becomes a chronic emergency that defines the entire first decade of Nike's existence, the butt faces. As we move deeper into the story, Knight introduces the group of people who form the core of what Nike becomes, and he calls them, with characteristic irreverence, the butt faces. This is not a corporate leadership team. It is something more complicated and, ultimately, more powerful. Jeff Johnson, the first full-time employee, is a former rival runner who writes Knight letters almost daily and runs the East Coast operation with a fervor that borders on religious devotion. Bob Waddell joins after a gymnastics accident leaves him in a wheelchair and becomes one of the most operationally indispensable people in the company. Del Hayes brings financial discipline to an organization that desperately needed it. G.F. Hollister runs grassroots athlete relations with an authenticity that no marketing budget could replicate. Penny, who eventually becomes Knight's wife, holds down logistics and administration during the years when the company has more chaos than infrastructure. These are not people who joined Nike because it was a prestigious career move. They joined because Knight's conviction was contagious, because the mission felt real, and because the culture Knight built accidentally and then intentionally was the kind of environment that makes talented people want to give everything they have. The butt-face meetings are legendary inside the company's history. Held annually, they are part strategy session, part argument, and part tribal ritual. Everyone insults everyone. Hierarchy dissolves. The most junior person in the room can challenge the most senior decision with profanity and full eye contact. Knight describes these meetings as the place where Nike's real decisions were made, where the pretense of corporate decorum was abandoned in favor of something more honest, more combustible, and ultimately more effective. Most companies spend enormous resources trying to build psychological safety. Knight built it accidentally through a culture of radical, unfiltered directness. This section of the book contains the mid-journey truth that most business storytelling deliberately omits. Nike did not feel like Nike from the inside during those years. It felt like a group of exhausted, underpaid, perpetually anxious people held together by shared belief and mutual stubbornness. There were no guarantees. There was no obvious inflection point where success felt assured. There was only the next crisis, handled by the same small group of people who had handled every crisis before it. The question every ambitious builder should sit with is this: do you have people in your life who would run toward a burning building with you? Because that is what building something real actually requires. The Shoe Wars. We arrive now at the chapter of the Nike story that nearly ends it entirely, the period Knight calls the Shoe Wars, the escalating battle with Onitsuka Tiger that transforms from a supplier relationship into an existential confrontation. By the early 1970s, Blue Ribbon Sports has built a genuine market presence in the United States. And Onitsuka, recognizing what they have helped create, begins quietly shopping Blue Ribbon's distribution territory to other American partners. They want to reclaim control of their American sales operation and cut Knight out entirely. Knight discovers this betrayal, almost by accident. A document left carelessly visible during a meeting in Japan reveals that Onitsuka is negotiating with other distributors simultaneously. The partnership that Knight had built his entire company upon is being dismantled beneath him while he is still standing on it. He has a choice: accept the terms Onitsuka will eventually offer, which will almost certainly reduce Blue Ribbon to a minor regional operator, or find another manufacturer and build an independent brand before Onitsuka can formally end the relationship. He chooses to build the brand. He approaches a Japanese trading company called Nisho Iwai to finance the transition and secretly begins sourcing shoes from a different Japanese manufacturer, Nippon Rubber. He needs to make the move before Onitsuka formally terminates the contract, because once the contract ends, he has no shoes to sell and no company to run. The timeline is brutal, the risk is total, and the legal exposure is significant. Knight and his team execute the transition under enormous pressure while maintaining the appearance of business as usual with Onitsuka. This moment is the crucible of the entire story, and what it reveals about Knight is something that no business school case study could adequately capture. He does not freeze. He does not wait for a better option. He acts decisively from a position of genuine vulnerability, with incomplete information and no guarantee of survival. The new brand needs a name. A designer named Carolyn Davidson is paid $35 to create a logo. The name comes from Jeff Johnson, who wakes up from a dream with a single word in his head. That word is Nike. The cash crisis, one of the most strategically important and emotionally raw sections of the entire book, is what Knight describes as the chronic, recurring, almost paralyzing cash crisis that defines Nike's financial reality for its first decade and beyond. Most people who know Nike today see a company with essentially limitless financial resources. What they do not see is the decade during which Knight could not make payroll without a bridge loan, during which banks threatened to call in their notes without warning, and during which the difference between Nike surviving and dissolving was often a single phone call from a lender. The relationship with the Bank of Oregon is one of the most instructive business narratives in the entire book. Knight's primary banker, a man named Harry White, extends credit repeatedly to Nike based on personal trust and a reading of the business that defied the bank's standard lending criteria. Then, White retires. His replacement, following standard procedure, reviews the Nike file with fresh eyes and immediately sees what any conservative lender would see: a company chronically overextended, growing faster than its balance sheet can support, and dependent on continued credit extension to remain solvent. The new banker calls the note. Knight scrambles. He approaches every other bank he knows. He considers selling equity to raise capital and protecting control simultaneously. He flies to Japan to renegotiate terms with Nissho Iwai. He manages the situation the way he manages every crisis, which is to say, he stays in motion, keeps multiple conversations open simultaneously, and never lets any single party see the full desperation of his position. Eventually, Nissho steps in as a financial backer, and the immediate crisis passes. But the pattern repeats again and again throughout the story. Financial survival is never assumed. It is earned month by month, deal by deal. The hidden business lesson woven through every one of these near-death experiences is one that most founders learn too late. Growth without adequate financing is not strength. It is a slow-building structural emergency. The decision Knight never made, and the one he reflects on with genuine ambivalence, is whether to sacrifice growth for financial stability or to sacrifice financial stability in pursuit of the scale that eventually makes Nike impossible to ignore. He chose growth every time. It nearly killed the company a dozen times. And it is also why Nike exists in its current form rather than as a footnote in the history of regional athletic footwear. Going public. The story reaches one of its most significant turning points when Knight finally makes the decision he had resisted for years, taking Nike public. The initial public offering in 1980 transforms the company's financial position overnight and creates enormous personal wealth for Knight and the core team who had survived the preceding decade of chronic uncertainty. But Knight's account of this moment is notably complicated emotionally. He does not describe it as a triumph in the simple sense. He describes it as a release of a specific kind of pressure that had defined the entire building experience and not entirely in ways he was ready to welcome. Going public meant accountability to shareholders whose primary interest was quarterly returns rather than the long-term mission Knight had always operated from. It meant transparency about decisions that Knight had previously made in the private insulation of his own judgment. It meant the end of Blue Ribbon Sports as a scrappy, privately held company with the identity of an underdog and the beginning of Nike as a publicly accountable institution with all the corporate obligations that entailed. For someone who had built his identity around operating outside conventional systems, this transition carried a psychological cost that the financial reward only partially offset. The IPO also crystallized something that Knight reflects on with striking honesty throughout the later chapters of the book. The people who built Nike with him, the butt faces, the early employees who accepted low salaries and high uncertainty because they believed in the mission, were richly rewarded by the public offering in ways that partially acknowledged the sacrifice they had made. But the reward also changed the company's culture in subtle ways that Knight found difficult to fully articulate. Money resolves one set of problems and introduces an entirely different set. And the problems that money introduces are often harder to name because they arrive inside something that looks like success. Key lessons and insights. Lesson 1. Begin before you are ready. The first lesson Shoe teaches with unmistakable force, and the one that has the most direct application to anyone building something today, is the discipline and courage to begin before you are ready. Phil Knight invented Blue Ribbon Sports in a boardroom in Japan before the company existed. He committed to a supplier before he had customers. He built a team before he had reliable revenue. At every stage he moved before the conditions for moving felt safe. And that pattern of premature action, executed with conviction, is precisely what created the conditions that eventually made Nike possible. The dangerous misconception most builders carry is that preparation is a prerequisite for action rather than a companion to it. Knight's story proves the opposite. The preparation happens in motion. The credibility develops through execution. The plan clarifies to contact with reality. Waiting until everything is aligned before beginning is a strategy that sounds cautious and feels disciplined but functions, in practice, as the most reliable way to ensure that nothing of consequence ever gets built. The world is full of perfectly prepared people who never began. Nike was built by someone who began when he had almost nothing except conviction. Lesson 2. Your team is the business. The second lesson cuts to the center of everything Knight understood about building an organization, and it is that your team is the business. Not your product, not your distribution, not your financial structure. The people you recruit, retain, and build culture around determine what your organization is capable of becoming, far more than any strategic decision you will ever make. Jeff Johnson running the East Coast operation with missionary intensity, Bill Bowerman redesigning shoes in his garage at 3 in the morning, Bob Waddell managing logistics from a wheelchair with complete calm under pressure. These are not supporting characters in the Nike story, they are the Nike story. The practical implication demands a specific kind of leadership clarity that most founders resist. Your instinct is to evaluate people based on their qualifications and their capacity to perform defined roles. Knight's approach was different. He hired people who believed in the mission with an intensity that bordered on irrational, then gave them enormous autonomy to execute that belief in whatever form their individual strengths suggested. Not everyone hired this way succeeds, but the ones who do become something no organizational chart can fully describe. They become co-owners of the mission, and that ownership produces a quality of effort that no compensation structure alone can manufacture. Lesson 3. Cash is oxygen, and you can never have enough. The third lesson is the one most aspiring entrepreneurs learn too late, and Shoe delivers it with unsparing honesty throughout virtually every chapter of the book. Cash is oxygen, and you can never have enough. Knight describes decades of building Nike under the constant pressure of insufficient working capital. The company grew every year. The company nearly died every year. Those two facts coexisted for longer than most founders could psychologically survive, and the single variable that determined whether any given crisis was survivable was always the same. Was there enough cash to buy the time that the solution required? The application for anyone building a business today is direct and uncomfortable. Revenue is not safety. Profit is not safety. Cash in the bank, with a runway long enough to absorb the unexpected, is the only real safety available to a growing business. Knight's regret, stated carefully and indirectly throughout the book, is not that he grew too fast. It is that he did not solve the financial infrastructure problem earlier, more permanently, and with greater strategic intentionality. Every entrepreneur reading this should ask right now whether they know their exact cash runway, what happens to that runway under 3 different stress scenarios, and whether their current banking relationships are strong enough to survive a crisis they have not yet anticipated. Lesson 4. Relationships are the real competitive moat. The fourth lesson emerges from the entire arc of Nike's supplier relationships, banking relationships, and athlete endorsement strategy, and it is that relationships are the real competitive moat. When Onitsuka tried to cut Knight out, Nisho Iwai stepped in. When the Bank of Oregon threatened to call the note, it was Knight's personal relationship capital, built across years of consistent dealing and hard-won trust, that opened alternative doors fast enough to prevent catastrophe. When Nike needed athletes to wear its shoes before the brand had the prestige to demand their attention, it was personal connections and genuine belief that secured those partnerships. Most people understand relationships as networking. Knight operates from a deeper understanding. For him, relationships are not assets you accumulate at industry events. They are obligations you build through repeated acts of honesty, competence, and commitment to shared interests. The Japanese business partners who backed Nike did so because Knight had demonstrated, across multiple difficult situations, that he was trustworthy in the specific way that sophisticated partners require. Not perfectly smooth, not always right, but consistent in his values, transparent about his problems, and reliable in his follow-through. That combination is rarer than talent and more valuable than almost any other competitive advantage a business can hold. Lesson 5. The mission must be larger than the money. The fifth and perhaps most personally resonant lesson in Shoe Dog is the one that runs beneath every other insight in the book, and it is that the mission must be larger than the money. Phil Knight did not build Nike to become wealthy. He built it because he genuinely believed that great athletic shoes could improve athletic performance, that running was a transformative physical and psychological practice, and that bringing the best running technology from Japan to American athletes was something worth dedicating his working life to. The money was a consequence of that belief, not its engine. This distinction is not sentimental. It is structural. The people who joined Knight during the lean years did not stay because the compensation was competitive. They stayed because the mission was real. The athletes who wore Nike before it was fashionable did so because the shoes performed, because the people behind the brand cared about performance. And when the inevitable crises arrived, as they did repeatedly and without warning, the thing that held the organization together was not contractual obligation or financial incentive. It was shared conviction about what they were building and why it mattered. Money alone has never held a team together through a genuine crisis. Mission has. The Vault Closing Shoe Dog is not ultimately a business book. It is a book about what it costs to build something real and whether you are willing to pay that price before you know what you will receive in return. Phil Knight spent decades not knowing whether Nike would survive. He made decisions from positions of profound uncertainty, with inadequate resources and incomplete information, and somehow produced one of the most recognized brands in human history. But the honest account he gives us is not one of triumph dressed as a retrospective. It is one of relentless, exhausting, frequently terrifying commitment to something he could not fully explain and could not bring himself to abandon. Your specific action for the next 7 days is to identify the one aspect of whatever you are building that you have been waiting for better conditions to address. Not the most urgent problem, the one you've been privately avoiding because it requires you to move before you feel ready, to ask for something before you've earned the right to ask, or to commit to a direction before the path is fully visible. Write it down. Then take the first step before the weekends. Not the whole step, just the first movement. Knight flew to Japan with $50 and a paper he wrote in business school. The beginning is always smaller than the outcome suggests. This is the Book Vault. We exist for the builders, the believers, and the people who are not yet sure if what they are building will survive, but cannot stop building it anyway. If this breakdown gave you something real, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop your biggest takeaway in the comments below. Tell us what part of Knight's story hit hardest for you personally. The community reading those comments understands what it means to be in the middle of building something uncertain and extraordinary. That community is what the Book Vault is for. We will see you in the next one.